It was a calm Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that seems ordinary at first, but carries the weight of unexpected events. The sun shone brightly over the busy streets just outside the city, where people hurried about their business. Among the rush of cars and the chatter of passersby, a man named Marcus Carter drove his car into the parking lot of a small convenience store. Marcus looked like any other person. He wore a simple navy blue jacket over a white t-shirt and a pair of dark jeans. His sneakers were worn but clean, and his car was an average sedan, the kind you'd see a dozen times in any neighborhood. To anyone watching, he seemed like someone running an errand, perhaps grabbing a snack or filling up on gas. But Marcus Carter was far from ordinary. Inside the pocket of his jacket, hidden from view, was a badge that told a very different story. Marcus was no average man. He was a high-ranking agent in the Secret Service. His job was one of immense responsibility, protecting some of the most important people in the country. He was trained to stay calm under pressure, to think quickly, and to act decisively. But none of that was obvious today. He blended into the crowd, just as he had been trained to do. As he pulled into the parking lot, Marcus noticed two police officers sitting in their patrol car a few spaces away. They were chatting, sipping coffee, and watching the world go by. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. Police officers often parked in public places like this, keeping an eye on things. He parked his car, stepped out, and closed the door behind him. But then, something caught his attention. The two officers weren't just watching the parking lot. They were watching him. Their gaze lingered on him, scrutinizing every movement he made. It was the kind of look that wasn't just casual curiosity. It was suspicion. Marcus had seen it before, many times, directed at people who looked like him. He knew exactly what it meant. Still, Marcus didn't let it bother him. He was used to situations like this. He walked calmly toward the store, his steps measured and unhurried. The officers exchanged a glance, their conversation quieting as they continued to watch him. Inside the store, Marcus grabbed a bottle of water and a small pack of gum. He made his way to the counter, paid for his items, and stepped back outside. The sun was warm on his face as he walked back to his car, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The officers were still watching him, their eyes narrowing as he approached his vehicle. One of them opened the car door and stepped out, his hand resting on the belt that held his service weapon. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp. "Hold up a second." Marcus turned slowly, his expression calm but alert. "Yes, officer," he said in a polite, even tone. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone tinged with suspicion. Marcus raised an eyebrow, holding up the small plastic bag containing his water and gum. "Just grabbing a few things," he replied. "Is there a problem?" The officer's partner joined him, standing a few steps behind with his arms crossed. "You live around here?" the second officer asked, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his tone steady. "I don't see how that's relevant. Is there something I can help you with?" The first officer frowned, clearly not liking Marcus's calm demeanor. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said. "Mind showing us some ID?" Marcus paused for a moment. He knew his rights. He knew that he didn't have to show them anything without a reason. But he also knew how quickly these situations could escalate. Staying calm was always the best approach. "Sure," he said, reaching into his pocket. Slowly, he pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer studied it, his expression unreadable. "This your car?" the second officer asked, gesturing to Marcus's vehicle. "Yes," Marcus replied. "Is there a problem?" The officers exchanged a glance, their suspicion deepening. They were looking for something, anything, to justify their behavior. Marcus could see it in their eyes. He had dealt with people like this before, people who judged him not by who he was but by what he looked like. "Step over here," the first officer said, gesturing toward the patrol car. Marcus complied, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood with his hands at his sides, making sure to appear as non-threatening as possible. The officers began asking him more questions: where he was coming from, where he was going, why he was in this neighborhood. The questions were unnecessary, invasive, and clearly aimed at finding fault where there was none. The small crowd began to gather nearby. People in the parking lot noticed the interaction and stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Marcus could hear their murmurs, the whispers of unease spreading through the group. "He didn't do anything," someone said quietly. "This doesn't look right," another added. But the officers didn't seem to care. They were focused entirely on Marcus, their voices growing sharper with each question. "What's in your pockets?" one officer demanded. "Just my wallet and keys," Marcus replied. "Empty them," the officer ordered. Marcus sighed inwardly but complied, pulling out his belongings and placing them on the hood of the patrol car. His movements were careful, deliberate, and slow. He knew the risks of making even the smallest sudden motion. As the officers continued their questioning, Marcus remained calm. But inside, he was frustrated. He knew this wasn't about any suspicious activity. It was about prejudice, it was about assumptions, and it was about power. The whispers from the crowd grew louder. More phones were pointed at the scene. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus glanced at the growing audience, then back at the officers. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He knew he needed to handle this carefully. What the officers didn't know was that Marcus Carter wasn't just anyone, and soon they would learn exactly who they were dealing with. The tension was thick as Marcus stood in front of the two officers, his belongings now laid out on the hood of the patrol car. The crowd's murmurs were growing louder, and the officers exchanged a glance that Marcus recognized all too well. They weren't used to their authority being questioned, not even subtly. Marcus could feel their unease morphing into something more dangerous. Frustration. "Spread your arms out," the first officer ordered, motioning as if he were already planning to pat Marcus down. "For what reason?" Marcus asked calmly, holding his ground but keeping his tone even. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also wasn't about to let them walk all over him. The officer's jaw tightened. "For my safety and yours," he replied curtly. Marcus could tell it was an excuse, a thinly veiled attempt to justify what they were doing. He glanced at the crowd, their phones now capturing every second. It wasn't just the phones, though. People were talking. "He didn't even do anything," one woman said, shaking her head. "This is messed up," another man muttered, his arms crossed as he stood near his car. The second officer stepped forward, clearly feeling the weight of the crowd's judgment. "Look, we don't want any trouble here. Just do as we say, and you'll be on your way." Marcus's sharp instincts, honed through years of intense training, kicked in. He knew their tactic: dominate the situation, intimidate, and hope the person they were targeting would cave under pressure. But Marcus wasn't just any person. "Officers," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, "I've complied with everything you've asked so far. You've seen my ID. You've checked my belongings. I'm standing here calmly, causing no threat. Now, I'd like to know, why are you treating me like a criminal?" The first officer scoffed, taking a step closer. "You think you're smarter than me," he said, his voice laced with irritation. Marcus didn't flinch. His calm expression never wavered. "No, officer. I think I'm within my rights to ask why I'm being detained without cause." The crowd murmured again, this time louder, emboldened by Marcus's measured confidence. "He's right," someone called out. "This is harassment," another voice chimed in. The officers stiffened, realizing that the situation was slipping out of their control. The first officer's hand hovered near his belt, and Marcus caught the subtle movement. He knew he had to tread carefully. Too much resistance could give them the excuse they were looking for. Still, Marcus had one advantage they didn't. He knew exactly who he was, and he knew the power that came with it. Marcus decided it was time to shift the narrative. "Officer," he said, Addressing the second cop, who seemed slightly less aggressive, "I'm going to ask you again. Why am I being detained? What's the justification here?" The second officer hesitated, glancing at his partner for backup. "Look, we've had some issues in the area. Suspicious behavior, break-ins. You matched the description." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Matched the description?" He echoed, his tone firm but still calm. "And what exactly is this description?" The officer stumbled over his words. Male, wearing a jacket, jeans." The weak excuse only fueled the crowd's frustration. A few people chuckled sarcastically. Others outright scoffed. "That could be anyone," a man in the crowd said, his arms crossed. "Yeah, real specific," another woman added, rolling her eyes. Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The officers were losing control of their fabricated narrative, and the crowd wasn't buying it. "I'll tell you what's really happening here," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for the growing audience to hear. "I walked into a store to buy water and gum. I walked out, and suddenly I'm a suspect. Is it because of what I'm wearing, or because of what I look like?" The crowd murmured louder, and the officers' faces darkened. The first officer stepped forward, his hand twitching near his belt. "Don't start this with me," he growled, his voice low but threatening. Marcus stayed calm, refusing to be intimidated. "Start what?" he asked evenly, pointing out the obvious. "If you had a real reason to detain me, you'd have said it by now." The second officer seemed to falter, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. The phones, the comments, it was all piling up, and he knew they were walking a very thin line. "Maybe we should," he began, but the first officer cut him off. "No, we're doing our job," he snapped, "and if he doesn't like it, that's his problem." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his sharp mind calculating his next move. He could continue pressing them, but there was a better way to end this. Underscore 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 underscore. The atmosphere shifted as a new figure entered the scene. An older man, dressed in a crisp suit, stepped out of a black sedan parked near the edge of the lot. His presence was commanding, his demeanor calm but unmistakably authoritative. The crowd turned to look at him, their murmurs quieting for a moment. The man walked steadily toward the officers, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice firm but not raised. The officers stiffened, their postures changing instantly. They recognized authority when they saw it, but they didn't seem to know exactly who this man was. "And you are?" the first officer asked, his tone laced with defensiveness. The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Someone who knows when things are being mishandled," he replied. He turned his gaze to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "Agent Carter," he said, nodding. The crowd gasped audibly. The officers' faces drained of color as the realization hit them. "Agent," the second officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave a small, knowing nod, pulling out his badge from his jacket pocket. He held it up for everyone to see. The gold emblem gleamed in the sunlight, and the words United States Secret Service were unmistakable. The crowd erupted, their voices a mix of shock, anger, and satisfaction. "I knew it," someone shouted. "They messed with the wrong guy," another voice chimed in. The officers looked utterly stunned, their earlier confidence replaced by a mix of panic and humiliation. Marcus didn't say a word, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The man in the suit turned to the officers, his tone cold. "You just detained a high-ranking federal agent without cause," he said. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've just created for yourselves?" The first officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The officers moved closer, their boots crunching against the loose gravel of the parking lot. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, had a look of authority etched into his face. His partner, shorter but stockier, hung back slightly, his eyes locked on Marcus as if expecting trouble. "Hey," the taller officer barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here?" Marcus paused, turning to face them. He kept his hands clearly visible at his sides, a habit ingrained in him through years of training. His expression remained calm, almost indifferent, though he could feel the tension building in the air. "Just grabbing some water," he said, lifting the small plastic bag that held the bottle he'd just purchased. The officers didn't seem satisfied. The taller one stepped closer, his posture rigid and his hand resting on his belt, not far from his holstered weapon. "This isn't a place to hang around," he said, his voice low and gruff. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus raised an eyebrow at the question. "I didn't realize I needed to live here to buy water," he replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. The second officer, the stocky one, moved forward now. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes were narrowed. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights. He wasn't required to show identification unless there was a legitimate reason for the request. But he also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. With a slight sigh, he reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, keeping his movements calm and measured. The taller officer took the ID and examined it, though it was clear he wasn't looking for anything specific. His eyes flicked back to Marcus, filled with a mix of suspicion and something else. Arrogance, perhaps. "What are you doing here, really?" he pressed. "I told you," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "I stopped to get some water. Is there a problem?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the ID to his partner, who looked it over with the same unnecessary scrutiny. The taller one took a step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "You don't look like someone who's just here for water," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. Marcus's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he forced himself to remain composed. "And what does someone who's here for water look like, exactly?" he asked. The question seemed to irritate the officer, who took another step forward. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "I'm asking the questions here." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. People exiting the store or walking through the parking lot had stopped to watch the interaction. Some of them were holding up their phones, recording the scene. The murmurs of concern and curiosity grew louder with each passing moment. "Is this really necessary?" someone in the crowd asked, their voice cutting through the tense silence. The officers ignored the question, their focus remaining entirely on Marcus. The stocky officer, still holding Marcus's ID, finally spoke up. "We've had some trouble in the area. Suspicious people hanging around, breaking into cars." "You match the description." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Suspicious people," he repeated. "And what description would that be?" The taller officer's face darkened. "We ask the questions," he said, his voice rising. "Now step aside. Hands on the car." Marcus didn't move immediately. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the eyes of the crowd watching closely. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Officers," he began, "I've complied with everything you've asked. I've shown you my ID. I've told you why I'm here. If you're accusing me of something, I'd like to know what it is." That was when the taller officer's patience seemed to snap. "Don't play games with me," he barked, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "I said, hands on the car." The stocky officer moved to block Marcus's path to his vehicle, his stance wide and defensive. The tension in the air was palpable now, almost suffocating. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their discomfort evident. "This doesn't look right," someone said, their voice tinged with unease. "Yeah, leave the guy alone," another voice called out. He didn't do anything. The officers ignored the crowd, their attention fixed on Marcus. The taller one stepped forward, reaching out to grab his arm. Marcus instinctively tensed, but didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any excuse to escalate the situation further. "Step aside." The officer barked again, his voice echoing across the parking lot. Marcus complied, moving to stand beside his car with his hands visible. The taller officer pulled out his handcuffs, his movements quick and aggressive. "Hands on the car," he ordered, louder this time. As Marcus placed his hands on the hood of his car, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. The foams, the whispers, the growing sense of outrage. It was all building, but the officers seemed oblivious. They were focused entirely on asserting their authority, blind to the consequences of their actions. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but firm. The stocky officer laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Oh yeah? And what mistake would that be?" he asked mockingly. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the growing crowd, the foam still pointed at the scene. He knew the truth would come out soon enough. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea of the storm they were about to unleash. Little did they know, Marcus Carter wasn't just an ordinary man. He wasn't just another person passing through the neighborhood. He was a highly trained Secret Service agent, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding the very laws they were now abusing. And soon, they would come to regret every word, every action. Marcus stood silently, his hands resting on the cold metal hood of his car. The taller officer leaned in, placing the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists with a harsh click. The cuffs were too tight, digging into his skin, but Marcus didn't flinch. He could feel the tension radiating off the two officers, their need to assert dominance clear in every move they made. "What exactly am I being detained for?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "Suspicious activity," the taller officer replied curtly, avoiding Marcus's gaze as he spoke. His partner shuffled nervously, glancing at the growing crowd. People were now openly voicing their concerns, their murmurs growing into louder protests. "This is wrong," shouted a middle-aged man from the edge of the parking lot. He had his phone raised high, recording every moment. "You can't just cuff someone for standing by their car." The officers ignored the comments, but their faces betrayed a hint of unease. They weren't just dealing with Marcus anymore. They were now under the scrutiny of an audience, and that audience wasn't buying their story. Marcus, despite the uncomfortable position he was in, stayed calm. He knew how to handle moments like these. His years of training had taught him to control his emotions, to think strategically even under pressure. This situation was no different from the countless crises he had faced in his career. Except this time, he wasn't protecting someone else. He was protecting himself. The taller officer gave Marcus a small shove toward the patrol car. "Sit tight," he muttered, his tone laced with irritation. Marcus complied, lowering himself onto the back seat of the police car. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the parking lot. Inside the car, Marcus watched as the officers turned their attention to the crowd. They exchanged a few words, their gestures indicating they were trying to regain control of the situation. But it wasn't working. The crowd's discontent was palpable, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "Why don't you just let him go?" a woman called out, her voice filled with frustration. "He didn't do anything." "Yeah, this is harassment," another man added, his tone sharp and accusatory. The taller officer turned to the crowd, raising his hands in an attempt to quiet them. "Stay back," he barked, his voice firm. "This is police business." "Police business," someone scoffed. "Looks more like abuse of power to me." Marcus leaned back against the seat, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He could see the cracks forming in the officer's facade. They weren't used to being questioned, especially not in such a public setting, and they certainly weren't prepared for what was about to happen next. The stocky officer stepped away from the crowd, pulling out his radio. He spoke into it in hushed tones, his back turned to the onlookers. Marcus couldn't hear what was being said, but he had a good idea. They were trying to figure out how to justify their actions, how to spin the narrative in their favor. But Marcus knew something they didn't. The truth always had a way of coming out. As the minutes ticked by, more people joined the scene. The parking lot, once a quiet stop for errands, had turned into a stage. The crowd was now a mix of concerned citizens, frustrated shoppers, and curious passersby. Some had come from inside the store, shaking their heads in disbelief as they watched the events unfold. "This isn't right," a young man said, his arms crossed as he stood near the patrol car. "They can't just do this." The officers were clearly feeling the pressure. The taller one's face was flushed, and his partner kept glancing nervously at the crowd. But instead of de-escalating, they doubled down. "We're handling it." The taller officer snapped at a man in the front row of the crowd. "Mind your own business." But the crowd wasn't backing down. If anything, the officer's dismissive attitude only fueled their anger. People began shouting questions, demanding answers. What did he do? Why is he in handcuffs? You're harassing him for no reason. Inside the patrol car, Marcus remained calm. He knew the tide was beginning to turn. The crowd's support was growing, their voices pushing back against the officer's authority. It was only a matter of time before the situation reached a boiling point. Suddenly, Marcus noticed movement near the edge of the parking lot. A sleek black SUV pulled in, its windows tinted and its engine humming quietly. The vehicle came to a smooth stop, and the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of professionalism and authority. His presence was commanding, his stride purposeful. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He recognized the man immediately. It was Special Agent Paul Reynolds, a close colleague and someone Marcus trusted implicitly. Paul's expression was calm but serious as he approached the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The crowd fell silent for a moment, their attention shifting to the newcomer. The officers, however, didn't seem to notice him at first. They were too busy trying to placate the crowd. Paul didn't waste any time. He walked straight up to the taller officer, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp and authoritative. The officer turned, startled by the interruption. His eyes narrowed as he took in Paul's appearance. "And who are you?" he demanded, his tone defensive. Paul reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for everyone to see. The gold emblem gleamed in the sunlight, the words United States Secret Service clearly visible. The crowd gasped audibly. The taller officer's face drained of color, and his partner took an involuntary step back. The tension in the air shifted, the balance of power tilting dramatically. "I'm Special Agent Paul Reynolds," Paul said, his voice steady and firm. "And you've just made a very big mistake." The cuffs tightened around Marcus's wrists, their cold steel biting into his skin. Despite the discomfort, Marcus remained calm, his face an unyielding mask of composure. His silence was deliberate, a calculated decision born from years of experience. He understood the power of presence, the way stillness could speak louder than words. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a threat, nor was it a plea. It was simply a statement of fact. The taller officer smirked, his arrogance palpable. "Yeah, sure," he sneered. "We've heard that one before." His partner let out a dry chuckle, though there was a hint of unease in his posture. Marcus said nothing more. He didn't need to. The calm in his eyes, the quiet strength in his demeanor, it was enough to make anyone paying attention second-guess their assumptions. But the officers, blinded by their own biases and authority, didn't notice. They were too busy trying to assert their dominance, too preoccupied with proving their unfounded suspicions right. The crowd, however, noticed. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, their whispers growing louder as they observed the scene unfold. "That guy looks too calm for this," someone said, their tone filled with curiosity and doubt. "Yeah," another voice added. "He doesn't seem like someone who's guilty of anything." Marcus allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The crowd's growing skepticism was a good sign. They were starting to question the narrative the officers were trying to spin. Before long, the officers shoved Marcus into the back of their squad car, the door slamming shut with a metallic thud. Inside, Marcus sat quietly, his sharp eyes scanning the scene outside. He could see the crowd growing larger, their discontent becoming more vocal. Near the edge of the parking lot, an older man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered face marked by years of hard work and experience. His presence commanded attention, and when he spoke, his voice carried an air of authority. "You boys sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. The taller officer turned sharply, his expression twisting with irritation. "Mind your business," he snapped, waving the man off. But the older man didn't budge. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "That's Agent Marcus Carter," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. The officers froze. For a moment, their masks of confidence faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The name seemed to strike a chord, though they weren't ready to admit they'd made a mistake. The stocky officer leaned in closer to his partner, whispering something hurriedly. Marcus couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the tension in their body language. The taller officer's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "You don't know what you're talking about," the taller officer finally said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. But there was no mistaking the unease in his eyes. The older man crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he replied. "And so will you, soon enough." Underscore 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 underscore. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, their tone shifting from curiosity to concern. People began piecing together the clues, their skepticism turning into outright disbelief. "Did he just say agent?" a young woman asked, her phone still recording. "Secret Service, maybe." Another person speculated, their voice laced with a mix of awe and confusion. The officers exchanged a nervous glance, their earlier confidence unraveling. The taller one turned back to Marcus, his posture stiff. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone less commanding now and more uncertain. Marcus met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I already told you," he said simply. "You're making a mistake." The stocky officer stepped back, pulling out his radio. His voice was low, hurried, as he spoke into the device. Marcus watched him carefully, noting the shift in his demeanor. They were starting to realize they were in over their heads, though they were too proud, or too stubborn, to admit it outright. Meanwhile, the older man didn't let up. He turned to address the crowd, his voice clear and deliberate. "This man you're seeing in handcuffs, he's not some random guy. He's a federal agent. These officers don't know who they're messing with." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, their disbelief quickly turning into outrage. "A federal agent," someone exclaimed. "Are you serious?" "This is insane," another person said, shaking their head. "They're going to regret this." The tension in the air was palpable, thick, and suffocating. The officers, now fully aware of the crowd's growing hostility, tried to regain control. But their efforts were futile. The damage was already done. Underscore 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 underscore. Inside the squad car, Marcus remained calm, his mind racing with calculations. He knew the officers were running out of options. The crowd's presence had turned what might have been a quiet abuse of power into a public spectacle. And the mention of his title, Agent Marcus Carter, had thrown them completely off balance. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, the cuffs digging into his wrists. He could hear the officers arguing in hushed tones outside the car, their voices tense and clipped. What if he really is someone important? The stocky officer asked, his words hurried and panicked. The taller one shook his head, his expression stubborn. No way. He's bluffing. And if he's not? The stocky one pressed, his voice rising slightly. What if we're wrong? The taller officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the car, his face a mask of frustration and uncertainty. He opened the door, leaning down to glare at Marcus. Who are you? He demanded again, his voice harsher this time. Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. You'll find out soon enough, he replied, his tone calm but firm. The officer's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He slammed the door shut and turned back to his partner, his voice low and urgent. We need to call this in. As the officers retreated to their patrol car, the crowd surged forward, their voices growing louder and more demanding. Marcus watched through the tinted windows, his sharp mind already anticipating what would happen next. Little did the officers know, their every move was being recorded, their actions scrutinized by the very people they had tried to intimidate. And little did they realize, the man they had cuffed and shoved into their car wasn't just another face in the crowd. Marcus Carter was about to remind them of the cost of underestimating the wrong person. The silence inside the squad car was broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Marcus leaned back, his hand still cuffed, his sharp gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. He could see the taller officer gesturing wildly as he spoke to his partner near the front of the car. They were clearly arguing now, their voices rising and falling even as they tried to keep them low. Marcus wasn't in a hurry to intervene. His years of training had taught him that patience often won the day. Besides, he knew exactly where this situation was headed, and he wasn't about to stop it from playing out. Outside, the crowd's anger had reached a boiling point. People were no longer just murmuring or recording. They were shouting. What are you arresting him for? Let him out. This is a disgrace. He hasn't done anything. The older man who had first spoken out remained at the forefront, his authoritative stance and booming voice cutting through the noise. You're digging yourselves into a deeper hole, boys, he warned, his eyes locked on the two officers. This crowd isn't going anywhere. And neither am I. The taller officer turned toward him, visibly exasperated. Step back, he barked, waving his hand in a dismissive gesture. This is official police business, and you're officially making fools of yourselves. The man shot back, crossing his arms. If you know what's good for you, you'll let that man go before this gets worse. The stocky officer shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between the older man and the increasingly restless crowd. We're handling it, he muttered, though it was clear he didn't believe his own words. The taller officer, however, wasn't ready to back down. He straightened his shoulders, planting his feet firmly on the asphalt. Nobody tells me how to do my job, he snapped. We've got protocol, and we're following it. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Protocol? This isn't protocol. This is profiling, plain and simple. You're out of line, both of you. underscore 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 underscore. Inside the car, Marcus observed the chaos with quiet amusement. The officers were crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny, their authority slipping through their fingers. He shifted slightly in his seat, the cuffs still tight around his wrists, and let out a slow, measured breath. The squad car's door opened suddenly, and the taller officer leaned in, his expression hard and tense. "Look," he said, his voice low and clipped, "if there's something you need to tell us, now's the time." Marcus tilted his head, meeting the officer's gaze with calm indifference. "I've already told you everything you need to know," he replied simply. "The rest is up to you." The officer's frustration was palpable. He slammed the door shut without another word, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. Underscore 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 underscore. Meanwhile, the older man wasn't letting up. He stepped closer to the officers, his voice rising above the commotion. "If you're smart, you'll call your supervisor right now," he said firmly. "Because when this blows up, and it will, you're going to wish you hadn't doubled down on stupidity." The stocky officer glanced at his partner, his brow furrowed. "Maybe we should call it in," he muttered under his breath. "This doesn't feel right." But the taller officer shook his head stubbornly. "No," he hissed. "We're handling this. We're not calling anyone." The crowd's reactions only grew louder. People were now openly criticizing the officers, their voices filled with anger and disbelief. Unbelievable. They're really going to dig their heels in. This is why people don't trust the police. Underscore 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 underscore. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed a sleek black SUV pull into the parking lot. The vehicle moved with quiet precision, coming to a stop a few spaces away from the patrol car. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man dressed in a crisp navy suit. His movements were deliberate, his expression calm but stern. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him as he recognized the man. It was Special Agent Paul Reynolds, one of his closest colleagues. Paul had a way of commanding attention without raising his voice, a skill that had served him well in countless high-pressure situations. The crowd seemed to sense that something was about to shift. Their murmurs quieted as Paul approached, his presence radiating authority. The officers, however, were too preoccupied to notice him at first. "Excuse me," Paul said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "What's going on here?" The taller officer turned, his irritation evident. "And who are you?" he snapped, clearly not in the mood for interruptions. Paul didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his badge. The gold emblem gleamed in the sunlight, its bold lettering unmistakable. United States Secret Service. The crowd gasped audibly, their disbelief giving way to stunned silence. Even the officers froze, their expressions shifting from annoyance to outright panic. "I'm Special Agent Paul Reynolds," Paul said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "And that man in your car is Agent Marcus Carter, one of the highest-ranking members of our team." The stocky officer's face turned ashen, and he took an involuntary step back. The taller officer, however, wasn't ready to concede just yet. That doesn't mean anything, he said, though his voice wavered. We were following protocol. Paul raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild amusement. Protocol, he echoed. Is that what you call this circus? Underscore 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 underscore. The tension was thick as Paul stepped closer to the patrol car. He opened the back door, helping Marcus out with a steady hand. The sight of Marcus standing tall, his composure unbroken, only fueled the crowd's growing sense of vindication. "You okay?" Paul asked quietly. Marcus nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Better now," he replied. Paul turned back to the officers, his expression hardening. "You've made a serious mistake," he said, his tone low but cutting. "And trust me, there will be consequences." The taller officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at his partner, who looked as though he wanted to melt into the pavement. The crowd, emboldened by the turn of events, erupted into cheers and applause. Justice. About time someone put them in their place. This is what accountability looks like. Underscore 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 underscore. The officers, now fully aware of the gravity of their actions, fumbled for an explanation. But there was nothing they could say to undo what had already been done. The truth was out, and their authority had crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. As Marcus and Paul walked away, the crowd parted to let them through. People clapped them on the back, their gratitude and admiration evident. Marcus, ever composed, simply nodded in acknowledgement, his mind already racing with the next steps. The officers would face the consequences of their actions. That much was certain. But for now, Marcus was content to let the truth speak for itself. Little did those officers know, this was only the beginning. Marcus sat calmly in the holding area of the precinct. The cold metal chair beneath him felt uncomfortable, and the dim fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the small room. He wasn't nervous or angry. He had no reason to be. He was patient, knowing the moment of reckoning was coming. For now, he let the clock tick away, his calm composure a stark contrast to the whirlwind of activity outside the room. Through the small glass window in the door, Marcus could see the arresting officers. They were standing at the front desk, their expressions strained as they spoke with the duty officer. Their body language screamed unease, their earlier bravado replaced with visible discomfort. Every now and then, they glanced toward the holding area, their eyes darting nervously. Marcus leaned back slightly, allowing a small, knowing smile to tug at the corners of his lips. He had seen this type of behavior before, people realizing they were in deep trouble, but still clinging to a shred of hope that they could somehow escape the consequences. Little did they know, their time was up. Underscore 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 underscore. After what felt like an hour, the door to the precinct swung open with force, the loud bang startling everyone in the room. A tall man in his late 50s strode in, his crisp uniform immaculately pressed, and his polished shoes clicking loudly against the tile floor. The badge on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the stern set of his jaw made it clear he was a man who didn't tolerate nonsense. It was the station supervisor, Captain Alan Foster. His reputation preceded him, a no-nonsense leader known for his fairness and firm approach to justice. He scanned the room quickly, his sharp eyes landing on the arresting officers. His expression darkened immediately. "What on earth is going on here?" Foster demanded, his booming voice silencing the low chatter in the precinct. His gaze was piercing as it shifted between the two officers, his posture radiating authority. The taller officer, now looking far less confident than he had earlier, opened his mouth to speak but faltered. He glanced at his partner, who looked equally lost for words. Finally, he stammered, "We thought he was." "You thought?" Foster cut in sharply, his voice rising with controlled anger. "You thought? That's your excuse for bringing in a man like this? Do you have any idea who this man is?" The room fell into an almost deafening silence. Every officer, clerk, and visitor in the precinct turned to watch the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was palpable, so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Marcus, still seated in the holding area, met Foster's gaze through the window. He gave a small nod, silently acknowledging the man's presence. Foster's jaw tightened as he turned back to the arresting officers. "This," Foster said, enunciating each word with precision, "is Agent Marcus Carter, one of the highest-ranking members of the United States Secret Service." The color drained from the officers' faces. The stocky one looked like he might faint, while the taller one's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer panic. Foster didn't stop there. He stepped closer to the officers, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you realize the gravity of your actions? You detained a federal agent without cause, humiliated him in public, and wasted everyone's time over what? Your assumptions." The taller officer tried to recover, his voice shaking as he spoke. We didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Foster snapped, cutting him off again. "You didn't know, and you didn't bother to find out. You acted recklessly, and now you're going to answer for it. Underscore 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 underscore. Foster turned on his heel and marched toward the holding area. He pushed the door open, his expression softening slightly as he addressed Marcus. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone respectful, "I deeply apologize for what's happened here. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Marcus stood up, his movements calm and measured. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said evenly. "But I think we both know an apology isn't enough." Foster nodded grimly. He reached for the keys on his belt and quickly unlocked the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. The sound of the metal clicking open seemed to echo through the silent precinct. Marcus rubbed his wrists briefly before straightening his jacket, his calm demeanor never wavering. Foster stepped aside, allowing Marcus to step forward. The room felt charged with tension as every eye followed his movements. He stopped in front of the two officers, who now looked thoroughly humiliated. "I'll let you explain this to my office," Marcus said, his voice steady but piercing. "I'm sure the director will want to hear why two of his men are wasting my time instead of focusing on real crime." The officers flinched as if Marcus's words had physically struck them. The stocky one looked down at his shoes, unable to meet Marcus's gaze, while the taller one shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with a mix of shame and fear. Marcus turned away from them, addressing Foster instead. "Captain, I trust you'll handle this appropriately." "You have my word," Foster replied firmly. He glanced back at the two officers, his expression hardening. "These men will face the consequences of their actions. I'll see to it personally." underscore 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 underscore. As Marcus stepped out of the precinct, the crisp evening air hit his face, a stark contrast to the stifling tension he had just left behind. He paused for a moment, glancing back at the building. The crowd that had gathered earlier had mostly dispersed, though a few onlookers lingered near the parking lot, their curiosity still piqued. One of them, the older man who had stood up for Marcus earlier, approached him. "You handled that with a lot of grace," the man said, his tone filled with respect. "Most people wouldn't have been able to keep their cool like that." Marcus gave a small smile. "Sometimes staying calm is the most powerful thing you can do," he replied. "Thank you for speaking up back there. It made a difference." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I just hope those officers learned something from this." "They will," Marcus said confidently. "One way or another, they will." Back at the precinct, the fallout from the incident was just beginning. Foster wasted no time in calling the officers into his office, his expression grim as he prepared to deliver a thorough reprimand. Meanwhile, news of the incident was already spreading through the department, leaving many of their colleagues shocked and appalled. For Marcus, the ordeal was a stark reminder of the challenges that still existed, even for someone in his position. But it was also a testament to the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice, of letting truth and integrity speak louder than anger or frustration. As he drove away, his mind was already turning to the next steps. The story was far from over, and he knew there would be more to address in the days to come. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, the satisfaction of knowing that justice, in its own way, had been served. As Marcus drove away from the precinct, the events of the day lingered in his mind. He had experienced situations like this before, but they never ceased to leave a sour taste. His training had taught him to stay composed under pressure, to maintain control even when others around him lost theirs. But today's incident wasn't just another routine encounter. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still plagued the very system he worked to uphold. The city lights blurred past as he navigated through the streets, his mind replaying the key moments. The officers' assumptions, their unwarranted aggression, the humiliation they had tried to impose. All of it painted a clear picture of a problem much larger than the two men in uniform. Marcus knew this wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented and the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur. Back at the precinct, Captain Foster wasted no time. After ensuring Marcus had left without further incident, he called the two officers into his office. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with a sharp edge of frustration, his expression as stern as the crisp lines of his uniform. The officers shuffled into the office like schoolboys caught misbehaving, their earlier arrogance completely gone. The taller officer, who had been the ringleader of the debacle, avoided Foster's gaze, while the stockier one looked downright miserable. "Close the door," Foster ordered, his voice cold. The sound of the door clicking shut seemed to amplify the tension in the room. The captain leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk as he stared them down. "Do you two have any idea how badly you've embarrassed this department today?" he asked, his tone low and controlled, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of anger. The taller officer tried to respond, his voice faltering as he spoke. "Captain, we thought—" "Stop right there," Foster interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear any excuses. You thought. That's your defense. You acted on nothing but assumptions, detained a federal agent without cause, and made a public spectacle of it in front of a crowd. Do you have any idea how damaging this could be?" The stocky officer, clearly more shaken than his partner, cleared his throat nervously. "We didn't know he was. That's the point," Foster snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. Both officers flinched. "You didn't know. And instead of taking the time to assess the situation properly, you decided to throw your weight around and make an arrest based on nothing but your own biases. The room fell silent as Foster's words hung in the air. The captain leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied the two men. Do you even understand who Agent Marcus Carter is? Do you know what his position entails? Neither officer answered. Foster didn't need them to. Agent Carter has dedicated his career to protecting the highest levels of this nation's leadership. He continued, his voice steady but firm. He's worked on cases and operations that are beyond your comprehension. And today, you treated him like a common criminal. Do you realize how that reflects on us? The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his face a mix of shame and frustration. Captain, you're suspended, Foster said abruptly, cutting him off. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Both of you, effective immediately. You'll hand over your badges and firearms before you leave this building. And believe me, this isn't the end of it. The officers exchanged a panicked glance, their protests dying in their throats. Foster's expression made it clear there was no room for negotiation. After dismissing the officers, Foster sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The day's events weighed heavily on him, and he knew there was still more to address. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, one reserved for the highest levels of coordination between local law enforcement and federal agencies. The voice on the other end was sharp and authoritative. Director Reynolds speaking. Director, Foster began, his tone respectful. This is Captain Foster of the 23rd Precinct. I need to speak with you regarding one of your agents, Marcus Carter. There was a brief pause before Reynolds responded, his voice carrying an edge of concern. What happened? Foster recounted the events in detail, sparing no facts. He described the officers' actions, the crowd's reaction, and Marcus's calm yet firm demeanor throughout the ordeal. As he spoke, he could hear the tension building in Reynolds' voice. This is unacceptable, Reynolds said finally, his tone laced with controlled anger. Agent Carter deserves better than this. I'll be expecting a full report by the end of the day. You'll have it, Foster assured him. And I'll make sure those officers face the consequences. See that you do, Reynolds replied. Marcus has worked tirelessly for this country. He shouldn't have to endure this kind of treatment, especially not from people who are supposed to uphold the law. By the next morning, news of the incident had begun to spread. Video footage taken by the crowd had gone viral, shared across social media platforms and news outlets. The clips showed the officers detaining Marcus, the crowd's growing outrage, and the moment Special Agent Paul Reynolds arrived to reveal Marcus's true identity. The public reaction was swift and intense. Hashtags calling for accountability trended within hours, and discussions about systemic bias in law enforcement dominated headlines. While many condemned the officers' actions, others expressed admiration for Marcus's composure and dignity throughout the ordeal. The precinct became the center of attention, with reporters camped outside, seeking statements from anyone willing to speak. Captain Foster, already burdened with the fallout, refused to give interviews, focusing instead on managing the internal investigation and preparing his report for the director. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his office at the Secret Service headquarters, sifting through emails and messages. Many were from colleagues expressing their support, while others came from community leaders and activists who had seen the footage. One message, however, stood out. It was from the older man who had defended him in the parking lot. The email was brief but heartfelt, expressing gratitude for Marcus's courage and calm under pressure. Marcus smiled as he read the message. It reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place, not for recognition or power, but to uphold justice and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The incident at the precinct had been a setback, but it also reinforced his commitment to his work. A week later, the precinct held a public meeting to address the incident. Captain Foster stood before a room filled with reporters, community members, and representatives from various organizations. He outlined the steps being taken to hold the officers accountable, emphasizing the importance of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Marcus attended the meeting, sitting quietly in the back. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to make a statement. As the meeting concluded, several attendees approached him, thanking him for his grace and strength in the face of adversity. Sometimes, Marcus said to one of them, "The best way to fight injustice is to let the truth speak for itself." The convenience store parking lot became a site of protests and vigils. Community leaders, activists, and citizens gathered there daily, holding signs and chanting for justice. Many of the signs read, "Respect is a right, not a privilege. Justice for all means all. And bias has no badge." One protester, a young woman named Erica, spoke passionately to a news crew. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is about every person who's ever been judged unfairly because of how they look." Marcus Carter handled this with grace, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. And we're here to make sure it doesn't happen again. The protests grew larger with each passing day, drawing people from all walks of life. Some carried candles, others carried cameras, but all carried the same demand: accountability. The convenience store parking lot, once a quiet, mundane spot, had transformed into a symbol of resistance and change. The officers involved in the incident, Sergeant Tim Rowley and Officer Jared Briggs, quickly became the focus of the public's ire. Their names and faces were plastered across the internet, and their actions were dissected in countless articles, opinion pieces, and social media threads. The precinct released a statement acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. But it wasn't enough to quell the outrage. People wanted more than promises. They wanted action. Within days, the precinct announced that both officers had been suspended pending an internal review. The move was met with mixed reactions. While some saw it as a step in the right direction, others felt it was too little, too late. "I'm glad they're suspended," one protester said during a live interview. "But suspension isn't justice. They need to be held accountable for their actions, not just given a slap on the wrist." As the investigation unfolded, more details about the officers' behavior came to light. Their bodycam footage revealed not only the incident with Marcus, but also other instances of questionable conduct. The footage painted a troubling picture of officers who often acted on biases rather than facts, treating certain individuals with unwarranted suspicion and hostility. The findings were damning. By the end of the investigation, both Rowley and Briggs were terminated from the force. The precinct's leadership issued a formal apology to Marcus and the public, acknowledging the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to persist. While the world around him buzzed with activity, Marcus returned to work with the same quiet dignity he had always displayed. He didn't seek the spotlight, nor did he let the incident define him. Instead, he focused on his duties, knowing that his actions and his calm resolve had already spoken volumes. Colleagues approached him with words of support and admiration. "You handled that better than most people ever could," one agent told him. "I don't think I could have kept my cool like you did." Marcus offered a small smile. "Sometimes staying calm is the best way to make your point," he replied. Anger clouds judgment. Composure reveals the truth. Despite his calm exterior, Marcus knew the incident had left a lasting mark on him. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and he doubted it would be the last. But it had reinforced his belief in the importance of accountability and the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. The convenience store parking lot, once just a forgettable corner of the city, had become a place of significance. People visited it to leave flowers, notes, and signs of support. Some came simply to reflect on what had happened there, to remind themselves of the work that still needed to be done. Local leaders saw the incident as a wake-up call. Meetings were held to discuss ways to address bias within the police force, and new training programs were implemented to help officers better understand and combat their own prejudices. Community members were invited to participate in these discussions, fostering a sense of collaboration and mutual respect. Marcus was invited to speak at one of these meetings. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't one to seek attention, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But he also knew the importance of using his voice when it mattered most. Standing before a room filled with officers, activists, and community leaders, Marcus spoke plainly but powerfully. "This isn't about me," he began. "This is about what I represent and what so many others have experienced. Bias isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle, creeping into decisions without people even realizing it. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Accountability isn't about punishment, it's about growth. It's about recognizing mistakes, learning from them, and doing better moving forward. That's what I hope comes out of all this. Not just justice for me, but change for everyone." His words were met with a standing ovation. Months after the incident, the precinct implemented sweeping reforms. New policies were introduced to ensure transparency and accountability, including mandatory body cam reviews and bias training for all officers. Community members were invited to participate in advisory boards, giving them a voice in how their neighborhoods were policed. The impact of these changes was felt almost immediately. Complaints of misconduct dropped, and trust between the police and the community began to slowly rebuild. The convenience store parking lot, once a place of conflict, had become a symbol of progress. For Marcus, the experience was a reminder of the strength that came from standing firm in one's principles. He continued his work with the Secret Service, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity and unshakable resolve that had defined him throughout his career. And while he never sought recognition, the incident left an indelible mark on those who had witnessed it. Marcus Carter became a symbol of resilience, integrity, and the power of truth in the face of injustice, a legacy that would continue to inspire others for years to come. The power of composure. Marcus often thought back to that day, not with anger or resentment, but with clarity. He knew that had he reacted differently, had he raised his voice or shown anger, it might have given the officers the excuse they were looking for to escalate the situation further. Instead, he had relied on his training, his patience, and his unshakable belief in the power of truth. "Strength isn't about how loud you can shout," Marcus had once told a younger agent during training. "It's about knowing when to stay silent and let your actions speak for you." That philosophy had guided him through his career and had proven itself true once again. The truth had worked its way to the surface, as it always did, and justice had followed. Marcus didn't need to demand respect because he carried it within himself. His composure and integrity had been his loudest weapons. The two officers involved in the incident, now stripped of their badges and facing public scrutiny, had no choice but to reflect on their actions. For Sergeant Tim Rowley, the taller and more aggressive of the two, the loss of his position was devastating. He had spent years climbing the ranks, but his unchecked arrogance and biases had cost him everything. In an interview with a local journalist, Rowley admitted, "I was wrong. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I paid the price. It's a hard lesson, but it's one I needed to learn." Officer Jared Briggs, the stockier and quieter of the two, had a harder time coming to terms with what had happened. He had always followed orders, but that day had shown him the consequences of blind loyalty. "I should have spoken up," he confessed to a friend. "I knew it didn't feel right, but I didn't say anything. And now I have to live with that." For both men, the incident served as a harsh but necessary reminder. Respect couldn't be selective, and assumptions could never replace facts. The incident also sparked conversations throughout the community. Schools, churches, and local organizations held forums to discuss implicit bias, respect, and accountability. People shared their own experiences, many of them echoing Marcus's story in smaller, quieter ways. A teacher named Mrs. Jenkins stood before her class one morning and asked, "How many of you have ever felt judged for something you can't control?" Hands shot up across the room, and the ensuing discussion became one of the most powerful moments in her teaching career. She ended the lesson with a simple yet profound statement. We never know someone's story just by looking at them. That's why respect must be our starting point, not our reward for approval. Back at work, Marcus's colleagues noticed a subtle change in him. He was the same composed and steady leader he had always been, but there was a new energy in the way he approached his role. The incident had deepened his resolve, reminding him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. During a team briefing, one of his colleagues, Agent Laura Myers, pulled him aside. "You've always been a role model, Marcus," she said, her voice warm with admiration. "But after what happened, I think we all look at you differently now. You didn't just show strength, you showed grace, and that's rare." Marcus thanked her with a quiet nod. He didn't seek validation, but hearing those words affirmed what he already knew, that his actions had meant something, not just to him, but to everyone who had been watching. The story of Marcus Carter continued to resonate far beyond the precinct or the convenience store parking lot. It became part of a larger conversation about respect, bias, and the need for systemic change. News outlets revisited the incident in documentaries and opinion pieces, using it as a case study for both the problems and potential within law enforcement. Activists used the story as a rallying cry, while law enforcement agencies across the country quietly introduced new training modules inspired by what had happened. These modules focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. One police chief in another city commented during an interview, "The Marcus Carter incident was a wake-up call for all of us. It reminded us that respect and fairness must be at the core of what we do. Anything less is unacceptable." In the months following the incident, Marcus took time to reflect on his own journey. He thought about the moments in his life that had shaped him, the people who had taught him the value of patience and humility, and the challenges that had tested his character. One evening, he sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees around him. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about the people who had supported him, the strangers in the crowd, the colleagues who stood by him, and the community that had rallied around his story. He also thought about the two officers. While he couldn't forget their actions, he found himself hoping they had learned something from the experience. "Sometimes it takes falling to see where you went wrong," he mused quietly. "I just hope they find a way to rise better than they were before." The convenience store parking lot eventually returned to its usual rhythm, with cars pulling in and out and people going about their business. But for those who knew its story, it was no longer just a place to buy snacks or fill up on gas. It was a symbol of justice, resilience, and the quiet strength of a man who refused to let prejudice define him. Years later, Marcus would still receive letters and emails from people who had been inspired by his story. Some wrote to thank him for his example, while others shared how his actions had given them the courage to stand up for themselves. One letter, written by a young boy named Ethan, stood out to Marcus. It read, "Dear Agent Carter, my teacher told us about what happened to you, and I just wanted to say you're my hero. I want to be like you when I grow up, calm, brave, and strong. Thank you for showing me how to be a good person." Marcus smiled as he read the letter, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He knew he wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but if his actions had inspired even one person, then it had all been worth it. Sometimes, the people we underestimate the most are the ones carrying the greatest strength. Marcus Carter didn't need to raise his voice or throw his weight around to make a point. He let the truth shine through, and in doing so, he showed the world what true strength looks like. As for those who had judged him unfairly, they learned a lesson they would never forget. You never know who's behind the surface. And respect, as Marcus always believed, should never depend on assumptions. It should be given freely, because it's the right thing to do.